The slums of Zurni were a place that most people tried to forget. Nestled beneath the towering spires of the wealthy district, the slums were a world apart, where the sun hardly touched the ground, and the air was thick with the smell of poverty and despair. It was in this dark, forgotten place that she lived. Her name was Lyra, but to most she was just another orphan, a lost cause. Lyra was not from this world. She was an alien, a small, delicate creature with pale, bluish skin and large, expressive eyes. Her people, once proud and powerful, had been wiped out in a war that ravaged her home planet. She had been one of the last survivors of her kind, sent away for safety when the war began. But even safety had turned against her. When the war ended, the planet where Lyra had taken refuge had already fallen into the hands of a new ruling class. The rich and powerful lived in shining glass towers that reached into the sky, while the poor, like Lyra, were relegated to the dark underbelly of the city. The ruling class had no interest in orphans, especially not one like Lyra. She was an alien, and that made her different. Different in a world that didn't welcome difference. No, one cared for Lyra. She had learned early on that people either ignored her or feared her. There were no kind words, no helping hands. She had learned to keep to herself, to stay out of sight, and to survive the only way she knew how, by stealing scraps from the markets, hiding in abandoned buildings, and keeping her head down. It wasn't always like this. Lyra remembered the stories her mother had told her, the stories of her home. A beautiful world with vast forests, bright skies, and cities filled with light. But that world was gone now. It was just a memory, a dream she clung to when the loneliness and fear became too much to bear. The days passed slowly for Lyra. She spent most of her time wandering the streets, hoping for a meal or a safe place to sleep. The cold nights were the worst. She had no shelter, no blanket, and no warmth. The stars above her seemed so far away, a reminder of the family she had lost and the life that could never be hers again. One day, as Lyra rummaged through a pile of discarded food outside a market, she noticed something different. A human. He wasn't like the others who walked past her, too busy with their own lives to notice the girl rummaging through the trash. This human stopped. He looked at her, not with fear or disgust, but with something else. Curiosity, maybe? Compassion? She looked up at him, wary, unsure of what to expect. The human was young, with dark hair and a simple, kind face. He had a rough look about him, like someone who had seen hardship, but there was no cruelty in his eyes. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. His words weren't loud, just an offering, an invitation. Lyra hesitated. She had grown used to ignoring people, especially humans. They never helped her. They either took what they wanted from the world or left it behind. Why would this one be any different? But hunger gnawed at her stomach louder than her doubts. Slowly, she nodded. Her throat felt dry, but she managed to croak out a word. "Yes." The human smiled slightly as though he had expected her to say that. "Come on then. I've got some food." He reached into his bag and pulled out a wrapped sandwich. He extended it toward her, but she stayed where she was, reluctant to take it. The human noticed her hesitation and, rather than pressing her, simply sat down on the ground a few feet away. He placed the sandwich between them, still within her reach, but not demanding her attention. "I'm Kian," he said quietly, glancing at her. "I know it's not much, but it's better than nothing." Lyra stared at the sandwich. It was so simple, just a piece of bread with some filling. But to her, it was more than enough. She hadn't had a proper meal in weeks, but more than that, it was the kindness. The kindness that she hadn't known in so long. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Kian just sat there, and Lyra slowly, tentatively, took the sandwich. She had no words for her gratitude, but she could feel the warmth of the food spread through her like a light she had almost forgotten existed. "Thank you," she whispered almost too quietly for him to hear. Kian smiled, his eyes softening. "No need to thank me. You don't have to be alone, you know." Lyra's heart clenched in her chest. She had heard people say things like that before, but they had never meant it. No one cared. No one ever came back to check if she was okay. They gave her pity, and that was all. But this human Kian wasn't offering pity. He was offering something far more valuable. He was offering his time. I'm not used to this, she said, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. There was hesitation in her voice. Fear, too. Why are you helping me? Kian shrugged, a small, gentle motion. Because I can, and because everyone deserves help, no matter where they come from. Lyra didn't know what to say. She had never met anyone like him before. Someone who didn't see her as just an alien orphan or a broken creature to be ignored. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone could care. She had been invisible for so long, lost in a world that had forgotten her. But Kian had seen her. And somehow in that moment she realized that maybe her life could be different. Maybe it didn't have to be filled with loneliness and coldness. Maybe there was still hope left. The moment wasn't magical. It wasn't some grand gesture. It was simply the offering of a sandwich by a kind human to a lonely girl. But for Lyra, it was the beginning of something much more. A new life, perhaps. Or at the very least, the chance to finally be seen. In the days that followed, Lyra found herself returning to the same spot where Kian had first offered her food. It wasn't much, just a small street corner with an old market on one side and a few run-down shops on the other. But it had become a place she felt she could breathe for a moment, away from the cold shadows of the slums. Every time she came, Kian was there, quietly going about his work, helping people, offering what little he could to those who were hungry, lonely, or in need. At first, Lyra had been hesitant, unsure whether to trust him, or if his kindness had an agenda she couldn't understand. But with each passing day, she found herself looking forward to their brief moments together. Kian had never asked for anything in return, never treated her like a burden or a stranger. He simply talked to her, like she was just another person, another soul in the world worth caring for. That was something Lyra wasn't used to. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the streets grew quieter, Lyra approached Kian again. She wasn't sure why she came. Maybe it was because the nights were getting colder, or maybe because she had finally begun to trust him. As she walked closer, she could see that Kian was sitting on a crate, sorting through a box of supplies. He looked up, and as always, his expression was calm, his eyes warm with understanding. "Hey, Lyra," he greeted her with a small smile. "Back again?" Lyra nodded, standing awkwardly for a moment. She didn't know what to say. She had never been good at this, being around people, letting them get close. But with Kian, she felt a sense of safety, something she hadn't felt in years. I wanted to thank you again," Lyra said, her voice soft but sincere. "For the food, and for being kind to me." Kian looked up at her, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "You don't have to keep thanking me, it's nothing." "No, it's not nothing," Lyra insisted, shaking her head. I've never met anyone like you. You don't treat me like I'm just some orphan or a nobody." Kian's smile faded a little, and he looked at her with something akin to understanding in his eyes. He stood up slowly and walked over to her, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not just an orphan, Lyra. You're a person, just like everyone else. You deserve to be seen, to be treated with respect." Lyra didn't know how to respond to that. She had spent so long believing she was invisible, that her existence meant nothing. But here was Kian, a stranger, telling her that she mattered. It made her feel vulnerable, like she had to believe in something she had almost forgotten how to trust. "I'm sorry," she whispered, lowering her gaze. "I don't know how to accept kindness. It feels strange." Kian didn't seem bothered by her uncertainty. He simply gave her a reassuring smile and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. I'm here. That's all." Lyra felt a warmth in her chest that wasn't just from the food Kian had given her. It was something deeper, a flicker of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Maybe, just maybe, she could trust this human. Maybe for the first time in a long while she didn't have to be alone. As the days passed, their encounters became a routine. Kian would show up at the market, offering food, supplies, and most importantly, kindness to anyone who needed it. Lyra, despite her fears and doubts, found herself coming back each time. She would sit nearby, watching him interact with the people, in the slums, amazed by how effortless it all seemed. There was no judgment in his eyes, no superiority, just compassion. One afternoon, Lyra found herself walking beside him as he made his rounds. She had never walked this closely to anyone before, and it felt strange to be so near him, yet so comfortable. They passed by other homeless people, some of whom eyed Lyra with curiosity, some with disdain. She had grown used to the harsh glares of the city's lower class, who often looked down on her for her alien heritage. But with Kian by her side, those glares seemed to lose their power. "I never asked," Kian said, glancing at her as they walked. "Where are you from? You don't seem like you're from around here." Lyra hesitated. The truth was something she hadn't shared with anyone in a long time. Her past was filled with pain, loss, and destruction. She had come to this planet out of desperation, hoping for safety, only to find herself abandoned, forgotten. She had no desire to relive those memories. I'm from far away," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My people, they're gone now. I don't remember much about where I came from." Kian looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful but not pressing. He didn't ask for more details, didn't push her to reveal anything she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he simply nodded. "Wherever you came from, you're here now," he said, his tone gentle. "And that's what matters. You're not alone anymore, Lyra. Not if I can help it." For the first time since she had arrived on this planet, Lyra felt a sense of belonging. She wasn't just some abandoned child anymore. She was a person, with a name, with a future. And that future, no matter how uncertain, didn't have to be faced alone. As the day drew to a close, Lyra found herself looking forward to tomorrow, not just for the food or the safety, but for the simple, powerful truth that Kian had shown her. Kindness still existed even in the darkest places, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a new beginning. Lyra sat quietly on the edge of the market square, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world was slowly fading into shadows, but for once, she didn't feel the weight of the dark, corners of the city pressing down on her. Kian had given her more than food and shelter. He had given her something she had almost forgotten to believe in: hope. As the evening settled in, Kian returned to where Lyra had been sitting. His usual bag of supplies slung over his shoulder. He seemed tired, but he still wore that soft, reassuring smile. "Hey, Lyra." He greeted her as he approached, his voice warm as always. "How's it going today?" Lyra nodded, a small smile on her face. "Better than usual," she said, her voice soft but sincere. She had learned not to expect much from life, but the small moments with Kian were changing that. They had become more than just fleeting encounters. She was beginning to see that her world didn't have to be full of shadows. There was kindness here, even in the smallest acts. Kian sat down beside her, placing the bag between them. He pulled out a small tin cup and handed it to her. "I've got something for you. Figured you might like it." Lyra took the cup, the warmth from the drink seeping through her fingers. She looked at Kian, slightly confused but grateful. "What is it?" she asked. "Just tea," he said with a grin. "Nothing special, but it's warm, and I thought it might make you feel better after such a long day." Lyra took a sip, the warmth of the tea spreading through her like a comfort she hadn't known she needed. She smiled up at him. "Thank you, Kian. You always seem to know what I need." Kian laughed softly, shaking his head. "It's nothing, I just like helping." They sat in silence for a few moments, watching the fading light together. There was something peaceful about this time, something that felt safe even in the middle of the chaos of the city. Lyra had never known peace like this before. The world had always seemed too loud, too full of danger. But here, with Kian, it felt different. It felt like she mattered. After a while, Kian shifted slightly, glancing at her with a more serious expression. "You know, I've been wondering," he began. "You never talk about where you came from. I've always assumed it's a personal thing, but I want you to know. You can talk to me about it, if you want." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come, the moment when Kian would want to know more about her past, about the truth she had kept hidden for so long. Her past wasn't just a story, it was a burden, a story of loss and survival, of a life torn apart by war. But she hadn't expected it to feel so hard to answer. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the cup. I don't think I can tell you everything," she said quietly. "My past, it's not a simple story." Kian nodded, his voice calm. "I understand. I'm not asking you to share everything, but I want you to know that whatever it is, you're not alone. You don't have to carry it by yourself." Lyra felt a lump form in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had said something like that to her. She hadn't even realized how much she needed to hear it until now. Kian wasn't pressing her for answers, he was offering her a choice. He wasn't forcing her to relive everything she had lost. But still, the truth weighed heavily on her chest, and for the first time in a long while she felt the urge to speak. "I came from a place far away," she began slowly, her voice trembling just a little. "I don't remember it well. It was a beautiful place, a peaceful place. I lived with my family, but everything changed when the war started." She paused, unsure if she should continue. But Kian was listening, his attention completely on her, his eyes gentle and patient. He didn't interrupt, didn't press her to hurry. He simply waited. "After the war started," Lyra continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "we were told to leave. My family, they sent me away to keep me safe. I don't know what happened to them, I never saw them again." The words came out in a rush, as though once she started speaking, she couldn't stop. She had never told anyone this before. Not in this way, not with someone who would listen without judgment. But now it felt like a release, like a burden lifting from her shoulders. "I ended up here, alone. I was just a little girl. No one cared. No one wanted me," she finished, her eyes cast down at the ground. "I've been surviving, on my own, ever since." There was silence between them for a long moment. Lyra didn't look up. She was too afraid of seeing pity or judgment in Kian's eyes. She had heard those words before from others. Poor thing. So tragic. But when Kian finally spoke, his voice was soft and full of understanding. "I can't imagine what you've been through," he said quietly. "But I do know one thing. What happened to you doesn't define who you are and what you've survived. It's not a weakness, Lyra. It's proof of your strength." Lyra's heart ached. She hadn't expected that, hadn't expected to hear such understanding from him. She had always been afraid that her past would be something that made her unworthy of kindness, but here Kian was telling her that her past didn't make her less. "I'm not strong," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm just tired." Kian smiled, a soft, reassuring smile. "Then let me help you carry the weight for a while. You don't have to be strong all the time." For the first time in years, Lyra allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face everything alone. She wasn't just a survivor of a broken past. She could be more. And with Kian by her side, she began to see a future she had almost lost hope of imagining. The truth she had carried alone for so long was no longer a burden. It was a part of who she was, yes, but it didn't have to define her. And in that moment, Lyra knew she had found someone who would stand by her, no matter what. The days after Lyra opened up to Kian felt different. There was a sense of peace between them now, an unspoken bond that neither had expected but both deeply appreciated. Lyra felt lighter, as if the weight of her past was no longer pressing down on her. She had shared the darkest part of her life with Kian, and instead of rejection, she had found acceptance. But peace, it seemed, was a fleeting thing. The world outside the small corner of the market where Lyra and Kian met was not kind, and as much as Lyra wanted to believe that things could change, reality had a way of reminding her of how dangerous the world really was. One evening, just a few days after their conversation, as Lyra and Kian sat together, a man approached them. His presence was imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothes that marked him as someone who belonged to the city's criminal underworld. He looked at them with eyes that showed no warmth, only cold calculation. Lyra stiffened, instinctively shifting closer to Kian. The man was a stranger, but his gaze made her feel uneasy, like she was once again a target to be hunted, not a person to be cared for. Kian noticed her discomfort immediately and stood up, placing himself between Lyra and the stranger. His posture was calm, but there was a readiness in the way he held himself that told Lyra he wasn't as relaxed as he appeared. "Can I help you?" Kian's voice was firm, but it held no aggression. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at Lyra with a knowing smirk. "She's the one, isn't she?" he said, his voice low and unsettling. "The lost princess from that destroyed planet, the one everyone's been looking for." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had known this day might come, but hearing the words spoken so openly still sent a wave of panic rushing through her. Kian glanced at Lyra, his eyes filled with concern. He didn't say anything, but she could see the worry in his face. He had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but Lyra knew. She could feel the danger in his words. The man continued, his tone growing colder. "There's a lot of people who would pay handsomely for her, and a lot of people who'd prefer she never existed. Either way, she's a pawn in a game bigger than either of us." Kian took a step forward, blocking the man's path. "You don't know anything about her," Kian said, his voice steady. "And I don't care what game you think you're playing. She's under my protection, and you're not taking her anywhere." The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Protection? From you? You're just a human. You can't stop what's coming." Lyra felt a chill creep up her spine. She had heard that tone before. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. A promise that someone somewhere was hunting her. She wasn't just a lost orphan. She was something far more important, something others would do anything to control. She reached out, touching Kian's arm lightly. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not safe here anymore. They know who I am." Kian turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm not going anywhere without you," he said firmly. He turned back to the man, his voice low and calm. "You better leave now, or I'll make sure you regret it." The man didn't look like he was going to back down, but just as quickly, as he had appeared, he seemed to reconsider. With a last cold glance at Lyra, he turned on his heel and walked away, vanishing into the growing darkness of the city. Lyra let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But the fear in her chest didn't subside. Instead, it grew. A gnawing sense that their lives had just changed forever. The man's words echoed in her mind. She wasn't just an orphan anymore, she was someone others wanted, someone with value. But it wasn't the kind of value that meant kindness. It was the kind of value that made her a target. Kian seemed to sense her unease. He knelt down in front of her, his expression softening. "You're safe. I won't let anyone take you from me." Lyra nodded, but doubt lingered in her eyes. "How can you be sure? The world is so much bigger than you think. They'll keep coming for me. And I don't know how much longer I can run." Kian reached out, gently cupping her chin with his hand and making her meet his gaze. "We'll figure it out together," he said firmly. "I don't care how big the world is. I care about you. You're not alone anymore, Lyra." His words were comforting, but a small part of Lyra still couldn't shake the fear. The universe had a way of tearing people apart, and it didn't matter how kind Kian was or how much he cared. The world she had come from, the world she had barely known, was still out there, and it would find her. It always found those who had something worth taking. That night, as they walked through the dark streets, the weight of the man's words lingered between them. Lyra didn't speak much, her mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. She had never asked for this, never wanted to be someone people fought over, but now it seemed she was caught in a game she couldn't control. Kian walked beside her, his presence a steady anchor. As they reached the edge of the market, he stopped and turned to her. "We'll figure this out. I won't let them hurt you, I promise." Lyra didn't know if she believed him completely, but for the first time in a long time she felt something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of security. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. The road ahead was uncertain. The danger was real. But Lyra wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. As they continued walking, the shadows of the city seemed a little less dark, and the weight on her shoulders a little less heavy. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for her to live without fear. The encounter with the stranger had shaken both Lyra and Kian. The words the man had spoken echoed in their minds long after he had disappeared into the shadows. Lyra was no longer the unknown orphan hiding in the slums. She was someone of importance, someone with enemies, someone who had been noticed, and that realization scared her more than anything else. They walked through the streets that night. Lyra felt the weight of it all pressed down on her. The safety she had felt just hours ago seemed fragile, like glass about to shatter. Kian walked beside her, but even he couldn't erase the fear that had settled deep in her chest. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "They'll keep coming, I can feel it." Kian didn't answer right away. He had been thinking the same thing. He could see the fear in Lyra's eyes, and it broke his heart. She had already been through so much. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel like she was running forever. "We can't stay here," Kian said finally, his voice determined. "It's not safe for you anymore." Lyra looked up at him, her heart heavy. "Where do we go? I don't know where to turn. I don't know who to trust." Kian stopped walking, turning to face her. His eyes softened with understanding. "We'll figure it out. I don't have all the answers, but I promise I won't leave you. You're not alone." Lyra nodded, grateful for his words, but still unsure of what the future held. She had spent so much of her life alone, and now that she had someone who cared, she wasn't sure how to handle the feelings that came with it. But Kian's promise gave her something she hadn't had in a long time. A glimmer of hope. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Kian continued, his tone steady and sure. "There's a place I know, a safe house on the outskirts of the city. It's run by some people I trust. They've helped others before." Lyra's brow furrowed. "Safe house? But why would they help us?" Kian hesitated for a moment before answering. "They're rebels, people who don't trust the government, who don't believe in the system here. They're not like the others. They'll help us get out of the city." Lyra wasn't sure what to think. She had never trusted anyone outside of the few people she had met in her life. But there was something about Kian's confidence that made her want to believe him. She had no choice but to trust him. "I don't know if I'm ready to face the world out there," she admitted softly, her voice breaking. "I've spent so long hiding. What if they find me again?" Kian stepped closer to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not running anymore, Lyra. We're taking control. You've been through enough. You deserve a life where you don't have to hide. We'll make sure you're safe. I won't let anyone hurt you." His words were like a balm to her soul, soothing the fear that had taken root in her heart. For the first time in what felt like forever, she began to believe that there could be a future for her, a future where she wasn't a target, where she wasn't living in the shadows. They spent the rest of the evening preparing for their escape. Kian had a few supplies, but they needed more to make it through the journey to the safe house. They would have to travel under cover of night, avoiding the main roads, moving quickly and quietly. As the night wore on, they gathered everything. They needed food, water, some clothes, and anything else that might be useful. The plan was simple. Get out of the city as fast as they could and make it to the safe house without drawing attention. Lyra had never been good at trusting people, but in this moment, she trusted Kian with her life. He had been nothing but kind and patient with her, and his promise to keep her safe was the one thing that made her believe they could make it through this. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. As they stood at the edge of the slums, ready to leave, Lyra looked back one last time. The streets she had walked every day for so long seemed different now, somehow more distant. She wasn't just running from her past anymore. She was running toward something, toward a chance at a life where she didn't have to hide. Kian looked at her, offering her a small smile. "Ready?" Lyra nodded, her heart racing but filled with determination. "Ready." With that, they began their journey. They moved through the dark streets, staying in the shadows and keeping to narrow alleyways. The city felt different at night, quieter, emptier, but Lyra knew that danger could still be lurking in every corner. As they moved, further from the city center, the tension in the air grew heavier. Lyra's eyes darted around nervously, every sound seeming louder than before. But Kian remained calm, always looking ahead, always focused on the goal. Hours passed, and the city's lights began to fade behind them. They were getting closer, to their destination, closer to the safety Kian had promised. But Lyra knew that the harder they went, the more Lyra felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was leaving everything behind, her old life, her old fears. The uncertainty of the future was terrifying, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of freedom that she couldn't ignore. They walked for hours, taking care to avoid any other travelers or the guards who patrolled the outskirts of the city. By the time the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, they reached a small, hidden camp on the edge of the city. It was surrounded by tall trees and overgrown bushes, making it nearly impossible to see from the main roads. "This is it," Kian said, his voice low as he turned to Lyra. "The safe house. It's not much, but it'll do for now." Lyra looked around, her eyes scanning the camp. There were several makeshift tents set up, and a few people were gathered around a small fire, talking quietly among themselves. Most of them looked like they had been through a lot. Rough clothes, tired faces, and eyes that held stories of their own. They were not the kind of people Lyra had expected to find in a place like this, but somehow, it felt right. These were people who had fought against the same system that had hurt her, people who understood what it meant to survive. As they approached, one of the figures standing by the fire turned to face them. He was a tall, wiry man with a beard and sharp eyes that seemed to assess them both in an instant. His expression was cautious, but not unfriendly. "Who are they, Kian?" the man asked, his voice rough, but curious. "This is Lyra," Kian answered, standing tall and looking the man in the eye. "She needs protection. They're after her." The man's eyes flicked to Lyra, and for a moment, she felt exposed under his gaze. But then he nodded, a small, knowing look in his eyes. "You're safe here," he said simply, stepping aside to let them enter the camp. "We don't take kindly to anyone threatening people under our protection." Lyra followed Kian into the camp, still unsure of what to make of the people around her. She had never trusted anyone outside of the few people she had met, and this was no different. But Kian seemed to trust them, and that was enough for her, for now. Kian led her to a small tent near the fire and motioned for her to sit. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, his voice softer now. "We've made it out of the city, but we need to be careful. We don't know who else is looking for you." Lyra nodded, grateful for the chance to sit and catch her breath. She had been on her feet for hours and her body ached from the strain. But even as she sat, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger. The city was behind them, but the world outside was vast and unknown. She couldn't help but feel like they were running, always running from something that might never let them go. As she sat there, Trying to calm her racing thoughts, a woman approached the fire. She was tall and lean, with long dark hair and a stern expression. She looked at Lyra for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to worry," the woman said in a low voice, her tone almost comforting. "We won't let anyone hurt you here, not while you're with us." Lyra looked at her, surprised by the woman's words. "But who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Why are you helping me?" The woman paused, her expression softening just a little. "We're the ones the system forgot, the ones who won't be controlled. We fight for people like you, for people who have nowhere else to turn." Lyra didn't know what to say. She had spent so long feeling like she was alone in the world, like no one cared about her, that the idea of someone fighting for her felt strange. But there was something about the woman's words that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her here, among people who understood. "You're not alone anymore," the woman continued, her voice kind but firm. "You don't have to run anymore. We'll help you. You have a family here now." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. Family. The word felt foreign to her, something she hadn't heard in so long. But here, in this camp, among people who had chosen to stand up against the forces that sought to control them, the idea of family felt possible. For the first time in a long time, Lyra allowed herself to believe that maybe she didn't have to keep running. Maybe there was a future for her, a future where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, where she wasn't a pawn in someone else's game. She had found a group of people who cared, who were willing to fight for her, and in that moment she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Keon sat beside her, his presence a steady reassurance. "We'll stay here for as long as we need to," he said quietly. "But we can't stay hidden forever. We'll figure out a plan, and we'll get you the help you need." Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of everything she had been through settle over her. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she had a choice. She could stand and fight. She could take control of her own fate. The morning sun had barely risen when Lyra woke up, her body stiff from the long hours spent lying on the hard ground. But it wasn't the discomfort of the night that kept her from sleeping. It was the weight of the decision she had to make. Keon had promised her safety, but that safety came with a price. The people at the camp were kind, but they weren't just offering shelter. They were asking her to join them in their fight, to stand up against the forces that had caused her pain, and that terrified her. She had never been a fighter. She had spent most of her life running, hiding, trying to survive. The idea of standing up to those who had hurt her seemed impossible. How could she, a poor orphan with nothing but memories of a lost home, stand against such powerful forces? But when she looked around the camp, she saw something that made her reconsider. These people weren't just hiding from their enemies. They were standing their ground. They had found a purpose, a cause they believed in, and they were willing to fight for it. Lyra had never had a cause of her own before, but as she sat there, surrounded by these people who had chosen to fight for a better future, she began to wonder if she could too. Keon was sitting by the fire when she finally stood, up, his eyes lifting to meet hers. He had always been there for her, offering kindness and protection. But now she needed more than that. She needed to decide whether to stay hidden or to step into the unknown, where danger lurked at every corner, but where freedom might be possible. "I'm ready to hear your plan," Lyra said, her voice steady. She was surprised at the confidence she felt in that moment, though it was still laced with uncertainty. Keon smiled, as though he had been waiting for her to say those words. He stood up and walked over to her, his expression serious but reassuring. "We're going to need you to make a choice," he said softly. "We can stay here, live under the radar, but the people who are after you won't stop. They'll keep hunting and they'll keep finding ways to hurt you." Lyra nodded, already knowing the truth of that. "And the other choice?" "We fight back," Keon said, his voice firm. "We expose the truth. We use your story to bring down the system that's been oppressing people like you, people like us. But it won't be easy. It will take everything we have. And you'll be a target, not just for them, but for everyone who wants to stop us. Lyra's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. Fighting back meant facing the enemy directly. It meant putting herself in the path of danger. But it also meant something else. Freedom. The chance to reclaim her life, her future. To not just survive, but to live. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if I can't do it? What if I fail?" Kian placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes soft with understanding. "We're all scared. We don't have to do this alone. You don't have to do this alone. We fight together. And if we fall together." Lyra took a deep breath, looking around at the camp once more. The people here weren't just survivors, they were warriors, fighting for a cause they believed in. She had never believed in anything before, at least not enough to stand up and fight for it. But now, as she looked at the faces around her, something inside her shifted. Maybe she could be part of something bigger. Maybe she could make a difference. "I want to fight," she said, her voice steady and filled with determination. "I'm tired of running." Kian's face lit up with pride. "You won't regret this," he said, squeezing her shoulder. "We'll make it through this. Together." The decision had been made. Lyra wasn't just an orphan anymore. She was a fighter, part of something much bigger than herself. She had a purpose now, a reason to stand tall. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew that with Kian and the others by her side, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Over the next few days, Lyra trained with the people in the camp, learning what it meant to fight, not just with weapons, but with courage and determination. She practiced moving in the shadows, avoiding detection and using her surroundings to her advantage. It wasn't easy, and there were times when she doubted herself, but each time she stumbled, Kian was there to offer encouragement. "You're doing great," he would say, his voice always steady, always supportive. "You're stronger than you think." And slowly she began to believe him. The camp was busy preparing for the next phase of their plan. They would go to the capital city, where the people who were after Lyra had the most power. They would expose the truth about the corrupt leaders, about the oppression that had been happening for years. It was a risky move, and Lyra could see the worry in the eyes of the rebels as they made their final preparations. But there was something else too: hope. As the day of their departure drew closer, Lyra found herself thinking about her home, the world she had lost, the family she could never see again. But now she realized it wasn't just about what she had lost. It was about what she could gain: a future, a chance to live, to fight for what was right, and to honor those who had fallen. That night, as she lay in her small tent, she closed her eyes and thought about the road ahead. It would be dangerous, there would be losses, and there would be moments when she would doubt herself. But for the first time, she didn't feel helpless. She didn't feel like a victim of the world. She felt like a part of something greater than herself, and that was a strength she hadn't known she had. Lyra's journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had made her choice. And now, with Kian by her side, and the rebels ready to fight, she was ready to face whatever came next.